something that always really irritates me, and it's not any fault of the TV shows, but I hate it when my beloved childhood favourite cartoons become CGI and they just look far too modernised. And I'm saying that as somebody who grew up in the 90s. I'm sure people who grew up in the 50s and 60s looked at the 90s versions and thought the exact same thing. But I'm always willing to check them out, and I am a lifelong fan of Alvin and the Chipmunks. I grew up with it, I loved the films. I thought I'd check out the TV series. This one is the one that was released in 2015, and I've only watched one episode for now. I just wanted to watch one to see what my initial thoughts and feelings were. And actually, there are a lot of things about which I'm impressed. So, the first episode is, well, actually, it's quite sinister in places. It's called Talkin Teddy, and this was released in 2015, directed by Janice Karman, and the first thing, when I clicked play, it launched straight into the theme song. The theme song. It sounded almost identical to the one from the kind of the 80s, 90s cartoon series. And I'm so glad they haven't kind of done anything to overly modernize it or make it unrecognizable. Genuinely impressed and really, really pleased. Then we meet the characters, and honestly, Theodore looks like Theodore. Simon, I don't like Simon's hair. It doesn't seem right. Alvin, though, I think Alvin looks like what I would have imagined a CGI Alvin. They do look less like chipmunks and more like boys. In fact, the only way you can kind of tell they're chipmunks, in this episode at least, is from the stripe down their face. They all have a stripe running down their face and over their nose. But other than that, if you didn't know they were chipmunks, it's very unlikely that you would be able to guess that. Is that a problem? Well, not really, but they certainly don't look as good as they do in, say, the Chipmunk movies. That design is much better. As for the narrative, Theodore has a soft toy called Talkin Teddy. He asks it questions, it's got pre-programmed answers in it. And Alvin and Simon are getting annoyed by this because this Teddy seems to dictate everything that they do. And they hatch a plan to try and get this Teddy out of their lives forever. I won't divulge what happens. It's relatively safe, but it does get kind of almost Chucky-esque at one point. It gets really creepy, but it's kind of a harmless narrative. But the one problem I have with it is that it makes Theodore really babyish. Now, Theodore, as far as I've interpreted the character, has never been immature. He's never been a baby, but he's always been more vulnerable and more nervous and more timorous, but that doesn't make him immature in his behaviour, just nervous of his surroundings. So I don't like the representation of Theodore here. It makes him come across as being younger and more juvenile than his brothers, whereas basically every other version he's clearly the same age, just not as confident. Now I've said that, and somebody may well point out that Theodore isn't the same age, and if that is the case, fair enough, but I've never interpreted that way. So for me, it feels very different. I was very impressed with the voice acting. Ross Bagdasarian Jr. voices Dave. Alvin is voiced by Emmanuel Garijo. Theodore, voiced by Janice Karman. Amazing. It's like the voice was plucked from the 90s. Absolutely incredible. I'm assuming that she didn't voice Alvin at any other point. Actually, no, she might well have done. So the praise that I've just given may actually be redundant. Yeah, she's voiced Theodore since 1981. So that's why Theodore sounded a lot like Theodore, because it's the same voice. But either way, I'm glad that that's maintained, that it isn't somebody else, or that it wasn't somebody doing a really bad interpretation of it. Ultimately, they haven't changed as much as I thought. I'm not the biggest fan of the CGI style, by which I said, even the films, the CGI films, they look better than they do here because they look more like chipmunks. Here they're trying to make them look too much like young boys, young children. But ultimately, I haven't got any real issues with it. I enjoyed this first episode. I'm not going to carry on watching the rest of the series because even though it makes me nostalgic, it doesn't really have that nostalgia element to it. But certainly, I've seen a lot more contemporary interpretations of classic animations that have gone a lot worse, a lot more badly. I'm losing my ability to speak. Ones that have been adapted for a more contemporary audience in a much more displeasing way. Alvin and the Chipmunks, this version, is not actually that bad.